Welcome to the Just Third Way podcast, where we ask the question, would you rather own or be owned? Brought to you by the Center for Economic and Social Justice at CESJ.org. Hello, welcome back once again to the podcast. I've got our normal panel that we get together to talk about the core values. And we're going to review core values number 3 and 4 today. Norm is here, Dr. Norman Curlin. Hello, Norm.
Here. Great to be with you.
Thank you. And Dawn Brohan. Hey, Dawn.
Hey, Dave. Thanks for this opportunity again.
All right. And Michael Graney. Hey, Mike.
Hi. How are you doing, Dave?
Great. We're glad to have you, and I'm pronouncing your name right.
Yes, for a change.
Well, in review of where we're at on the core values, I was kind of putting together some notes about it, and I noticed there's a significant progression in the order that they're in terms of sort of a logical path that they follow. And they go from just the basic, I guess, foundation, and then progress on to sort of advanced thoughts that lead. It's almost like a logical path that leads you to what we're talking about when it comes to seeking economic and social justice. And so I'm instead of starting with number 3, which is what we're going to talk about first, we're talking about 3 and 4 today. I'm going to go ahead and go back to number 1 and read that up through number 3, and then we'll talk about that, and then I'll read number 4 and we'll talk about that. So here are the first 3 core values. There is an ultimate source of all creation and of all universal and absolute values such as truth, beauty, love, and justice, which represents the highest ends of human actions. Many people call this source God. Nothing should stand between God and the human person. So we've talked about those 2 before, and then here's the third one that we're going to talk about now. There is a hierarchy of human work. The highest form of work is perfecting the social order to elevate each person in his or her relationship to God. The lowest but most urgent form of work is for sheer personal survival. So that is the first 3, and the third one there. Well, Norm, there are many human factors holding us all back, part of human nature that keeps us from focusing on doing good and getting off our lazy butts and doing things. How can CESJ's focus on organizing society to be more just for all help this situation?
Well, it's in a discussion of what is work and why is that so important. And in that discussion, we could see that there are at least several forms of work. One is what you work for pay. It's economic work, where you're part of the production system.
Right.
The second is work beyond the economic work, what Aristotle called the work of civilization. Doing things not for money, but because you know that they're going to increase our relationship to one another, to create what might be called the cardinal virtues. And one of the virtues, or good habits, as opposed to the vices or bad habits, one of the critical virtues is justice. And,
right.
and so what we were formed to do is to promote a better understanding of justice, because many people, including lawyers, do not understand the word. They don't teach justice in a sound way, or not at all, in most of the law schools. So you have these people who are writing the laws who don't understand justice. And I think one of our reasons for being as an organization is to help teach the meaning of the word justice, and then even taking it apart. And that is, you must work for the dignity of every human person. You must be able to do whatever you can do best to help people and to unite society, to have a common interest. So consequently, the idea of work is in the ultimate source is to change the system so that every person can meet their the ultimate purpose of life. And the lowest and most urgent form, as we say, is simply to meet our animal needs, sheer personal survival, and that you can call Kelso called the economic system. It's not as high as your social and your political system, and a system that would educate everyone from the time they were born and begin to be educated all throughout their life on how they can work for the common good.
Right, right. We all have to focus on survival first, but if we had a system that allowed us to get sort of past that basic stuff, then we could focus on some of the more important things, I think. And you said you had some thoughts about that, Dawn?
Yeah, I think when we talk about the gradations of work, or the difference in types of work depending on whether it's for your survival needs or for your highest spiritual needs, this just brought to mind Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of human needs, which is how we're looking at how you structure our society, our social system, so that every person can progress through those various human needs, starting with survival, then security, then social interactions and recognition. And then Maslow was talking about self-actualization. You might call that the full development of each human being. And then I think in reference to each person's relationship to God, as we mentioned in the core values, you have these spiritual needs. And it's, people may fulfill some of these needs, not necessarily in that orderly progression, but certainly if you don't address their survival needs and their security needs, it's going to tend to bring out the worst in people. So that goes back to your point about human nature factors and how something that's natural to us, like self-interest and self-preservation, how that can, under the wrong situation or the wrong social system, can bring out selfishness and greed. And so we do see that how we surround ourselves with, our social environment, our institutional environment, is going to either bring out the good or maybe the bad in each of us.
Right, right. Very good point.
I think the thing, Dave, that we want to recognize is that universities at the highest level tell you that the purpose of an education is to get a job, and these are top flight universities recognized around the world. Not that it's important to do your economic work. See the difference between economic work and the work of civilization. And so we ought to be recognizing that you do the work of civilization, whether it's politics, art, music, things that are creative. Even changing the system is work for civilization. So our whole purpose of forming the Center for Economic and Social Justice is to teach what is justice, what is economic justice, and what is social justice. How do they fit?
Right. Well, Mike, we haven't heard from you yet, and I was going to ask you, why does CESJ include the relationship with God in this area of high goals?
Well, it's very easy to answer, and it builds on what Norm and Dawn said. It's actually a way of answering the question, what is the meaning and purpose of life? Now, I realize that starts to get a little bit deep, but it's actually a very simple question to answer. The meaning and purpose of life for human beings is to become more fully human. I mean, you've said the whole thing right there. Unfortunately, that also raises a lot of other questions, such as how do you do that and what does that mean?
Right.
Well, if you have an ultimate source of everything, then everything that exists must be in conformity with that absolute source. In other words, if there is an all good creator, then everything that's created must be all good. And so that means that to fulfill your meaning and purpose of life, you must become good. You must seek the good. This is what Aristotle started out his whole theory of life and politics and ethics and everything else, is based on the premise that the meaning and purpose of life is to search, seek for, and become good. And then you live the good life, which is the life of virtue. Virtue is a word that means humanness. So the more virtuous you are, the more human you are.
Isn't that a little bit of a contradiction? The word human and good, to some people, you say I'm only human, that means I have flaws.
Yeah, what you're raising is what they call the problem of evil. How do we, account for the fact that if God is all good and everything he created is all good, how do we account for stuff that's bad? Well,
Right.
2 words, free will. God didn't create slaves. He created people, human beings, to be friends, partners, and so on, his brothers and sisters.
Right.
So, but you can't be that if you're everything you do is predetermined by, well, since God created everything good, I can only do good. I have no choice in the matter. Well, in order to make certain that we were really his friends, really his children, really his brothers and sisters, he gave us free will. We have to choose to be good. We're not just good automatically.
Right.
It's not, you don't just flip a switch. Okay, you're human, you're good. Everything you do is A-okay. Now, the question then, devolves into, well, why does CESJ, the Center for Economic and Social Justice, worry about this? Well, to pursue justice is to pursue the good. And that means you must have the power to pursue good. And power ordinarily comes from capital ownership. As Daniel Webster said, power naturally and necessarily follows property. And since we naturally live as political animals in society, we have to structure our institutions to be such that they provide the proper environment so that we can choose good. So
Right.
the process of becoming more fully human and building a relationship with God freely of our own free will means that you have to pursue the good of your own free will. You have to interact with others in a just manner. You have to treat others as you would yourself. The whole long list.
Another aspect of that is that we recognize that we're not perfect. And therefore, we created the state, we created the system, money system, etc. It wasn't created by God. So no matter what we do as human beings, it'll be imperfect. But our objective is to enable people who are now unhappy because they're not fully human in the sense that Mike was describing, so that you change the system so that it begins to give people the power not only to work in the economic arena, but also ultimately as the technology displaces many forms of human work, people become more and more free, they have more and more time, and they have the money from ownership so that they can then work more in the work of civilization. And to us, that will bring out the good side, the happy side. It will enable people to be what they are not today. So we don't have a world so divided now. America so divided. Well, how do we unite America? So, the point that Mike makes, Dawn makes, are very valid. But we have to change the system, and God is not going to change the system. We have to.
The way Norm said something reminded me that I have to correct a misimpression I may have made when I say that people have to become more fully human. Every single human being is as human and is human in the same way as every other human being. Mm-hmm. It's like in the Constitution where it says, come together to form a more perfect union. And people will say, well, if it's a perfect union, how can it be more perfect? Well, what we have as human beings is not, we are all fully human and human in the same way, but we're not as perfect as we could be as humans. So human beings have what they say, we are infinitely perfectible. We'll never be fully perfect. God is the only thing that is infinitely perfect. We are infinitely perfectible, so we always go toward that, and that's how we build our relationship with God, and the reason for doing so that we are always coming closer and closer and closer, but we'll never quite get there.
Right, and I think that was an excellent point that Mike made, and it jumps back to the first core value about the ultimate source of creation and of all universal absolute values such as truth, beauty, love, and justice, which represent the highest ends of human actions, that just in the pursuit of justice, we go back to Deuteronomy, justice, justice, thou shalt pursue. And that's understanding that, as Mike and Norm have said, that human beings aren't perfect. We are perfectible. Our struggle to understand and fulfill justice is never ending. So that's one of the points we make is in social justice. The work of fixing our institutions it's ongoing. It never ends. So I think that the point of each human being seeking a relationship with this source of what is perfect, what is true, and what is just that is the value of why people should be seeking a relationship with this ultimate source.
Yeah, that's good. Well, do any of you have an opinion on whether some systems are designed to keep people doing the most urgent form of work so they won't have the means or the time to change things? Do you have any ideas of how we can help people break out of that?
That's why the core values are important, but they lead you finally to our proposed set of solutions. You see, the money system must be changed because it does cause concentration of ownership, whether it's going to be in a monopoly capitalist system, so a small elite of owners have control over politics as well as various forms of life, and everybody works for them rather. And so we have the Capital Homestead Act in our website, which describes the various monetary changes, tax changes, inheritance law changes, by which we can grow the system without inflation so that there be many more forms of work while the robots begin displacing, and artificial intelligence displace many forms of work, but in a way in which it will not be harmful if every child, every woman, every man has an equal opportunity to own the robots, to own artificial intelligence, to be able to develop the kinds of technology that will eliminate the need for the fossil fuels, etc. But that's another question. We're still dealing at what are the values we should have as we approach other people, as we approach academia, as we approach politicians and the rich, because we're not out to take anything away from the rich for what they now own, but rather we're saying you will have an opportunity, but the poorest person in the country, if not in the world, should have an equal opportunity to become an owner of capital.
Another way of looking at what Norm just said is looking at our systems. You have to ask how power is diffused or concentrated by the system, by the institutions. And he mentioned the money system, for example, is a way that those who now control the economy and politics continue in the future to gain more power and keep it concentrated. So whether this is a system of monopoly capitalism or socialism, where power is even more concentrated, then the question is, when you ask how can people get out of this sort of system, you have to then look at, always pay attention to power and how it's distributed. And does the system systematically spread power out, or does it tend to allow power to become concentrated again? So, the American system of checks and balances, for example, that's one way of ensuring that power gets spread out. But unfortunately, if you don't look at the question of who owns, and you only look at political power, then you're going to have that aspect of survival, humans beings, their most basic needs. That's how they can have a vote. But if they're starving, they'll be very willing to sell their votes. So we do have to look at all types of power, whatever kind of power, and make sure that our systems spread it out to each and every human being.
That is a great way of looking at it. You're right. Okay, well, Norm mentioned fossil fuels, and we all, know what's coming up in the next, actually, core value number 4. I'll go ahead and read it. In interacting with nature to promote one's own perfection, every person must respect the rest of creation. Each human being, a steward of nature, remains responsible for conserving natural forms of existence, each of which is interdependent and shares the same divine origin with humanity. That's pretty clear what it's talking about, and I always think of that Bucky Fuller quote. The part about being a steward of nature should appeal to everyone, but especially environmentalists like members of the Green Party. And Dawn, I know that that's something that you've worked on and talked about. Do you have any thoughts for someone in that camp about reaching their goals via the just third way?
Well, again, I think it goes back to the question of power, who's making the decisions, including how we interact with our surroundings, the environment, the natural world around us. And I think what the just third way does, it reminds us that we must be looking at ourselves as part of an overall world. And one of the ways that the just third way would help in addressing some of the problems we face with environmental crises or questions such as climate change is it offers a way that we can control our technologies so that we take into account what we say in this core value is that we must conserve natural forms of existence and respect the rest of nature. And some technologies are going to perform in such a way that they cause environmental degradation, and others will be designed, as Bucky Fuller was trying to do, so that it's respecting patterns in nature, respecting the environment, not wasting resources. And a lot of this, the reason we don't deal with it effectively, there's a number of reasons. I would say education is one, that maybe people aren't aware of the damage that we're doing or how to, to mitigate it or avoid it. And then the other reason is, can we afford the new energy sources that cause less damage to the planet? Can we afford technologies that waste fewer resources? And I think there are these technologies ready to be brought into the marketplace, but right now they can't be financed. So in terms of an application like the Capital Homestead Act, which is now providing access to sufficient financing to purchase these and bring into being these new types of technologies, that's how we would address it and make sure that every human being has a voice in how technology is being used and, what kind of environment they want to live in.
Right.
One thing we want to be able to do is recognize that changes of the system are going to hurt some people. Let's say the coal miners, the workers who work in West Virginia, for example, who are mining coal. And suddenly they say you're going to take away our food, where we won't have jobs. Well, we have to think about that. We also have to think about the owners of the fossil fuels. Will we once we have the ability, and I think we now have the ability, and we've had it for years, to begin to develop the alternate energy technologies. But as Dawn pointed out, there isn't the money for that. But we also have to provide through the money system something that will, one, encourage, create jobs and opportunities for the workers in the fossil fuel industries, new jobs, new industries, and develop, particularly relating to the energy area. If you have to produce artificial intelligence and robots, have some of that being done by the companies and the workers, so that the owners should not be punished for technological change. But this is the kind of thing that when we act as a united group who are trying to make the world work better, we have to take into account everybody's needs, but also always in terms of the ultimate needs, the needs to create a system of peace, where we're not end the class warfare that takes place when you have monopoly capitalism against all the other forms of collectivism. But none of them really focus on everyone, even the minority, someone who disagrees with everyone else. He could be an Einstein. So we have to be very open-minded about the process and take into account how the various kinds of problems that are inherent to change of the economic order.
Right. And I mentioned that Fuller quote. I'm going to go ahead and give it here. We are called to be architects of the future, not its victims. Our challenge is to make the world work for 100% of humanity in the shortest possible time through spontaneous cooperation without ecological offense or the disadvantage of anyone. And that's R. Buckminster Fuller, also known as Bucky Fuller. So if you've ever heard that, you know that CESJ thinks highly of Bucky Fuller and that particular quote, and it relates to this core value. You know, Mike, I see a parallel between how the lowest form of work is for survival and the perceived need to put survival before being a good steward of nature. So don't we almost need to get all people above survival mode in order to save our planet?
Yeah, that it's almost a no-brainer, because if people don't have enough to live on, that's going to be their overriding consideration. I mean, how on earth do you become more fully human if you can't even stay alive as a human being?
Right. That's so true.
And this is the main problem with both socialism and capitalism, as well as virtually every other ism on the face of the earth. They look solely to the material. I mean, one of the biggest things about socialism, when it first started out, they called it the democratic religion, because it got rid of all that God stuff and said, basically, the meaning and purpose of life is to be fat, dumb, and happy in this one.
I would go for that.
Well, you're not so dumb.
Because we start with Kelso's ideas, we want to understand how Kelso looked at Karl Marx. And he said, and Marx invented the term capitalism, which, if capital are things, they're really talking about thingism. So, and Kelso appreciated that Marx was against monopoly capitalism, and the socialists were against monopoly and they should be. So it's the monopoly, that concentration of power, that will always lead to corruption. Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power, as Lord Acton said, corrupts absolutely. So it's right. Moving from the reality of a corrupt world to how do we make it into a world where of harmony, of peace, and good government. The establishment of justice was so key to the formation of America, and you see that in the preamble of the Constitution.
The socialists looked at capitalism and said, concentration of productive assets in the hands of just a few people is very bad. So let's make things better by concentrating ownership of productive assets in the state. That will make everything perfect.
Yeah, right.
Well, he made it clear that he said you can summarize the entire philosophy in a single sentence: abolition of private property. And then the dictatorship of the proletariat would be the state. So you had a dictator. It would become more concentrated than under capitalism. So we have to see that there must be not just a third way, but a just third way. So that's why we were formed as an organization, to help people better understand the term justice, and particularly economic justice, social justice. They're not on the left. No, they're universal once we understand those terms.
Right. And just to bring it back to the original question you asked, Dave, don't we need to get all people above survival mode to save our planet? I think we see the connection that in order for us to thrive, the planet needs to thrive. And in order for the planet to thrive, all people need to be able to thrive. In order to, if we don't overcome the problems of war and poverty and environmental damage, that's going to lead to certainly hard times for humanity.
Right. And that is a good way to sort of wrap it up when we're thinking about how we do have the solution to the conflict that has raged on for centuries between sort of this free, open, it becomes an attempt to have a free, open market, a capitalist framework, and the other side being collectivist, trying to do things as a group, but for some reason it never seems to work. Things always end up being corrupt. There's dictators, and it comes back to ownership, and that's what our message is. So I really appreciate you guys taking the time to talk about these two core values. I'm going to wrap it up. I'm going to mention that you can join CESJ by going to cesj.org and clicking on participate. And then if you would like to become a member, there is a place for that. And you can become a paying member for $25 per year. And also a student membership is $15 per year, and that qualifies you for discounts on our materials, such as books, which you can buy many of and distribute to your friends and family. And also, if you'd like to participate and comment on the podcast, feel free to call. I have a voicemail set up. I'd like to hear what you have to say, and I'll play it on the podcast. The number is 678-719-2840. So I'll wrap it up and I'll say, own or be owned.